In the late summer of 2023, the humid air of Louisiana enveloped the small town of St. Martinville, nestled deep in the swamps. St. Martinville felt timeless, its mysteries hidden by the dense forests and murky waters that surrounded it. The town's narrow streets, lined with aging homes weathered by the relentless sun, moved at a slow, sleepy pace. Everyone believed they knew each other's business, though few knew the full truth. Aisha Dupree, 28 years old, had spent most of her life in St. Martinville. She was a beautiful woman with soft features and eyes that held untold stories. Aisha's life hadn't always been centered here. She had originally come from New Orleans, where she lived until her early 20s. After her mother's sudden death in a car accident when Aisha was 21, her life took a surprising turn. With no siblings and a strained relationship with her father, Aisha found herself adrift, uncertain of what to do next. It was then that her Aunt Mrs. Loretta offered her a home in St. Martinville, a small town far from the chaos of the city. Mrs. Loretta, now 50, had always been a strong figure in the Dupree family. A widow and a woman of resolve, she had raised her daughter Tanisha with firm discipline and unconditional love. Taking Aisha in was more than an act of family duty. It was her way of offering Aisha a fresh start and a chance to heal in the tranquility of the town. Aisha, grateful for the refuge, moved in with her aunt and cousin, hoping to find peace after the grief of losing her mother. She quickly found work as a teacher at the local elementary school, where the children adored her. However, despite her attractiveness and intelligence, Aisha struggled with deep-seated self-doubt that she couldn't shake. Life in St. Martinville had become routine. She would wake up, care for Mrs. Loretta, go to school, and then return to a home that, though full of family, often felt lonely. Over the past few years, Mrs. Loretta's health had worsened as cancer slowly consumed her. The once strong matriarch now relied on her daughter and niece for care. Aisha did her best to support her aunt, but seeing Mrs. Loretta go from a strong, vibrant woman to a frail, sickly figure was a constant reminder of the cruelty of life's fleeting nature. Mrs. Loretta, too, noticed the changes. She was aware that her family was not as close as it once had been, and she worried about the growing distance between her daughter Tanisha and Aisha. Tanisha, Aisha's cousin and Mrs. Loretta's only child, was only a year younger than Aisha. At 27, Tanisha was loving and kind, as her mother had taught her to be, but she was completely unaware of the turmoil brewing within her own home. 2 years earlier, she had married Desmond Johnson, a man she thought was her soulmate. Desmond was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted, but Tanisha couldn't see his darker side. She spent most of her time caring for her sick mother, focusing all her love on a marriage that was quietly falling apart, though she was unaware. Desmond Johnson, at 30, was a man who thrived on manipulation. Tall, with a smooth voice and dark eyes that seemed to hide secrets, Desmond had a way of making people trust him. His criminal past was known in St. Martinville, though people rarely spoke of it. Whispers about his shady dealings followed him, but Desmond had a talent for making people forget or overlook the darkness that surrounded him. He was the type of man who could bend others to his will without them realizing it. And it was this skill that he began to use on Aisha. Aisha had always felt a certain distance between herself and Tanisha, a gap that widened as they grew older and took different paths. But it wasn't until Desmond entered her life that Aisha started to question everything she thought she knew. Desmond had a way of making Aisha feel seen, in a way she hadn't in years. He would stop by the house under the pretense of checking on Mrs. Loretta or bringing Tanisha something she had forgotten, but his true purpose was to see Aisha. Their conversations began innocently enough, with small talk about the town or the weather, but there was always an underlying tension, an unspoken connection. Aisha knew it was wrong, the growing attraction she felt for her cousin's husband, but she couldn't resist it. Desmond made her feel alive, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. He was everything her life wasn't: dangerous, exciting, unpredictable. Though she tried to suppress those feelings, they kept rising to the surface, tempting her with the idea of something different, something more. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Aisha and Desmond deepened. It started subtly: a lingering glance, a hand that stayed a moment too long on her arm, a smile shared that carried more meaning than it should have. Aisha found herself constantly thinking about him, replaying their conversations, wondering if he felt the same way. She hated herself for it, for betraying her cousin even in her thoughts. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. What had begun as casual visits to check on Mrs. Loretta slowly evolved into something far more complicated. Desmond's charm was undeniable. He had a way of making Aisha feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't in years. It began with brief conversations in the kitchen while Tanisha was out, sharing coffee in the mornings before the day's responsibilities began. But as each day passed, those small moments took on greater significance. Meanwhile, Tanisha, ever trusting, remained blissfully unaware of the growing bond between her husband and cousin. She was completely consumed with caring for Mrs. Loretta, who was growing weaker by the day. Tanisha found comfort in knowing that Aisha and Desmond were there to help, never suspecting that their connection was becoming something far deeper than mere familial duty. She often expressed her gratitude to Aisha for being such a devoted niece, and to Desmond for being the attentive husband she had always dreamed of. Tanisha's blindness to what was happening right under her nose only intensified Aisha's guilt. Each time Tanisha thanked her, it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. One evening, after another long day of caring for Mrs. Loretta, Aisha and Desmond found themselves alone in the kitchen. The air was thick with humidity, and the silence between them was charged with unspoken emotions. Desmond leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on Aisha as she tried to busy herself with the dishes. But she could feel his gaze, the magnetic pull between them growing stronger. Finally, unable to endure the silence any longer, Aisha turned to face him, her heart racing. Desmond stepped closer, his voice low and serious. Aisha, you know I care about you, right? You've been there for me, for Tanisha, for Mrs. Loretta. I don't know what we would have done without you. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She knew where this was going, and every part of her screamed to stop it, to walk away. But she couldn't move, couldn't break the spell Desmond had cast over her. Before she could speak, Desmond reached out, brushing his hand against her arm. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shock of electricity through her. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You mean more to me than you know, Aisha. I've been trying to fight it, but I can't deny what I feel for you. Aisha's resolve crumbled. She knew this was wrong, knew she was betraying her cousin, but the intensity of Desmond's words and the warmth of his touch overwhelmed her. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could give in to the feelings that had been building between them. The weight of her responsibilities, the suffocating routine of her life, all seemed to fade in that instant. That night, as Aisha lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Desmond, but the guilt was overwhelming. She had almost crossed a line she could never return from, and the thought terrified her. Yet despite her fear, she couldn't shake the image of Desmond from her thoughts. She couldn't ignore the way her heart raced whenever he was near. The temptation grew stronger with each passing day, and Aisha knew her life was on the verge of a decision that could change everything. The weekend that would ignite everything had only just begun. A storm within the Dupree family began in a seemingly innocent way. It was mid-September, and the air in St. Martinville carried a slight hint of the upcoming fall. Tanisha, eager for a short break from the weight of her responsibilities, had planned a weekend getaway to visit a close friend in Baton Rouge. She left on a Friday afternoon, feeling upbeat and excited to unwind and catch up. She trusted Desmond completely, believing his assurances that he would take care of everything at home, including checking in on her mother, Mrs. Loretta, who had been under Aisha's attentive care. As Tanisha's car disappeared from view, Desmond's thoughts shifted to the opportunity before him. He had been waiting patiently, biding his time for the right moment to act on the growing tension between him and Aisha. With Tanisha now gone, he saw his chance to take the next step. He understood that Aisha was conflicted, battling feelings she tried to suppress, but he also sensed that her defenses were weakening. The time had come to push those boundaries and see how far Aisha would go. That evening, Desmond casually suggested to Aisha that they spend some time together since Tanisha was away. He proposed a simple plan, a quiet dinner followed by a drive around town. It seemed like something any family might do, but the unspoken tension between them made it clear this was no ordinary evening. Aisha, despite the nagging voice in her head warning her to stay away, agreed. She convinced herself it was just dinner, just a drive, nothing more. Yet deep down, she knew the lines between right and wrong were already becoming blurry. Dinner was at a cozy local cafe called Bonham. Aisha and Desmond sat by the window, the soft glow of the evening sun casting a warm light over their table. They ordered simple dishes. Desmond chose the shrimp po' boy, while Aisha opted for the gumbo, a dish she had always loved. The atmosphere seemed relaxed at first, but underneath, an unspoken tension simmered. Desmond was attentive, his gaze never leaving Aisha's, making her feel flustered. After dinner, Desmond suggested the drive. The night was warm, the sky clear, and the full moon cast a gentle light over the quiet streets of St. Martinville. Aisha agreed, hoping that the cool night air would clear her head and give her some sense of control. They drove through familiar streets, the conversation continuing in the same easy, light-hearted manner. But as they left the town behind, and the roads grew darker and more desolate, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. Desmond eventually stopped at a secluded spot near the bayou, a place where the only sounds were the rustling trees and the distant calls of night birds. He turned off the engine, and for a moment they sat in silence, the only light coming from the moon's reflection on the still water. Aisha's heart raced, and her mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen next. She knew she should leave, that she should say goodnight and return home. But the pull of Desmond's presence was too strong. Sensing her hesitation, Desmond reached out and gently took her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down Aisha's spine. He turned to her, his expression serious, yet his eyes were filled with the same desire she felt. "Aisha," he whispered softly, his voice barely audible, "I know this is complicated, but there's something between us. Something real." Aisha tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She knew he was right. The attraction between them had been building for weeks, maybe even months, and now that they were alone, it was impossible to ignore. Desmond leaned in, still holding her hand, and before she could react, his lips were on hers. The kiss started softly, hesitantly, almost as if offering her a chance to pull away. But Aisha didn't. Instead, she responded, her own desire overtaking the guilt that had been holding her back. What began as a tentative kiss quickly escalated, the passion that had been simmering just beneath the surface finally exploding. They were unable to resist the pull any longer. Desmond's hands roamed over Aisha's body, and she responded with equal intensity, the weight of their betrayal momentarily forgotten in the heat of the moment. In the darkness of the car, they crossed a line that could never be undone, their bodies intertwining in a forbidden embrace. When it was over, reality crashed down on Aisha with such force that it left her breathless. She had just betrayed her cousin in the worst possible way, and the guilt was overwhelming. But alongside the guilt, there was a feeling of satisfaction, a thrill that she couldn't deny. Desmond, sensing her turmoil, tried to comfort her, reassuring her that everything would be okay. But Aisha knew better. They had stepped onto a dangerous path that could only lead to heartache and destruction. In the days that followed, Aisha and Desmond began meeting in secret. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments filled with the same dangerous mix of passion and guilt. They knew they were playing with fire, but the excitement of their affair was too intoxicating to resist. They were careful, always choosing their moments wisely. But in a small town like St. Martinville, secrets were hard to keep. Mrs. Loretta, though weakened by her illness, wasn't blind to the changes in Aisha and Desmond's behavior. She noticed how Aisha avoided looking at Desmond and how he seemed to linger in her presence a little too long. Mrs. Loretta tried to talk to Aisha, expressing her concerns, but Aisha always brushed her off, insisting everything was fine and that she was just tired from the stress of caring for her mother. But Mrs. Loretta knew better. She could feel the tension in the air, the unease that had settled over her home like a dark cloud. The discovery came on a sweltering August afternoon, when the oppressive Louisiana heat seemed to suffocate everything. Tanisha had returned early from work, exhausted and sticky with sweat, hoping to find relief in the coolness of her home. Desmond had left his phone on the kitchen counter, its screen flashing with an incoming message. Tanisha barely glanced at it, but something at the back of her mind nagged at her, a suspicion she had been pushing aside for weeks. The small voice that told her things weren't right, that Desmond had been distant and secretive lately. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Tanisha picked up his phone. The message was from Aisha, her cousin, the woman she had trusted most in the world. Tanisha's heart began to race as she opened the message thread, her hands trembling. What she saw made her blood run cold. A series of messages filled with affection and desire, the kind of words no cousin should ever exchange with her husband. The words blurred as tears filled Tanisha's eyes, her worst fears confirmed. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and dizzy with rage. Tanisha's world began to spin out of control, and she stormed out of the house, her vision clouded by anger and heartbreak, heading straight for Aisha's home. She didn't care about the neighbors watching or the inevitable gossip. She needed answers. She had to confront the two people who had destroyed her life. When she arrived, Aisha was preparing dinner for Mrs. Loretta. Her face turned pale when she saw the fury etched on Tanisha's face. "What is this?" Tanisha demanded, shoving the phone into Aisha's hands, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. Aisha's eyes widened as she saw the messages. Her own guilt reflected back at her in the harsh light of the screen. She tried to explain, to justify what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Nothing she said could make it right. Tanisha was beyond listening. She had trusted Aisha like a sister, and this betrayal was too deep, too painful to understand. As the confrontation escalated, Desmond arrived, sensing the storm that had been brewing. His attempt to calm Tanisha only fueled her fury. The air in the room crackled with the intensity of emotions that had been simmering for far too long. Mrs. Loretta, frail and weakened by her illness, struggled to intervene, but her voice was drowned out by the shouting and accusations. It was as though the entire family was unraveling at the seams, every hidden resentment and unspoken words spilling out, poisoning the air between them. Tanisha's voice broke as she demanded to know how long the affair had been going on, and how the people she loved most could betray her so cruelly. Overcome with shame, Aisha could barely meet her cousin's gaze. Desmond, ever the manipulator, tried to shift the blame, downplaying the seriousness of what had happened. But Tanisha saw through his lies. The trust that had once held them together was shattered beyond repair. The damage was irreversible, the pieces too jagged and sharp to ever be reassembled. In the tense days following the confrontation, Tanisha withdrew inward, barely speaking, as the crushing weight of betrayal overwhelmed her. The memories of what she had discovered, Desmond and Aisha's secret exchanges, the lies that unraveled her world, consumed her. Drowning in anger and despair, Tanisha felt lost, drifting in her emotions. Needing to escape, she decided to leave town for a few days, unsure of where she was going. She packed a bag and drove away from St. Martinville, leaving without a word. Meanwhile, Desmond, noticing her absence, saw the opportunity to meet with Aisha. Despite her fear and guilt, Aisha couldn't resist him. Desmond suggested they meet at a remote swamp area, a secluded spot they both knew. Aisha agreed, though a heavy dread weighed on her. The swamp, a place of hidden secrets, seemed like a fitting setting for such a dark meeting. The overcast sky matched her mood as she drove there, thoughts of regret and confusion swirling in her mind. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? When she arrived, Desmond was already waiting, his unreadable expression unsettling her further. They walked into the swamp, the silence thick with unspoken tension. When they reached a small clearing, Desmond began to speak about their situation and possible ways forward, but his words felt hollow to Aisha. She sensed he was trying to manipulate her, and her anxiety deepened. Suddenly, Tanisha emerged from the shadows, her face twisted with a mix of anguish and fury. She had followed them, driven by heartbreak. The sight of her cousin and husband together in this secluded spot pushed her over the edge. The confrontation was explosive, with Tanisha hurling accusations at them, her pain clear in every word. Desmond tried to calm her, but she was beyond reason. In a desperate fit, Tanisha stormed to Desmond's car and retrieved the gun he always kept in the glove compartment. Aisha watched in horror as Tanisha, trembling with rage, aimed the weapon at her, screaming for answers and justice. Desmond and Aisha pleaded with her to calm down, but Tanisha was too far gone. Desmond tried to approach, hoping to disarm her, but in the chaos, he inadvertently blocked Aisha from Tanisha's line of sight. Tanisha's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gun fired. The sound of the shot shattered the swamp's silence, and Aisha was struck. She staggered, eyes wide in shock, before collapsing. For a moment, everything was still. the air thick with the scent of gunpowder. Desmond, acting instinctively, wrestled the gun from Tanisha, who stood in shock, trembling as she realized they had crossed an irreversible line. Desmond coldly suggested they cover up the crime. The swamp's murky waters seemed the perfect place to hide the body. Numb and broken, Tanisha followed Desmond as they dragged Aisha's lifeless body to a secluded part of the swamp. They weighed her down with stones and watched as the water swallowed her. The finality of their actions settled over them like a suffocating shroud. Tanisha could barely comprehend what she had just done, her mind reeling from the enormity of it. After the harrowing events in the swamp, Tanisha and Desmond returned to Mrs. Loretta's home, trying to keep up appearances. They sat down with her, weaving a tale to cover up what had happened. Desmond explained that he had ended things with Aisha, and during their conversation, Aisha had become upset and stormed off into the night. Tanisha, playing the role of the forgiving wife, added that she had chosen to forgive Desmond, but that they had no idea where Aisha had gone afterward. Mrs. Loretta, though concerned, listened carefully. However, a seed of doubt began to grow in her mind. As they left for their own home, she tried to call Aisha repeatedly, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. The absence of Aisha's voice on the other end only deepened her concern. By nightfall, with no sign of Aisha returning home, Mrs. Loretta's anxiety turned into panic. This was unlike Aisha. She never stayed out without letting her mother know where she was. Fearing the worst, Mrs. Loretta called the police, reporting her daughter missing and voicing her suspicion that something was seriously wrong. The police responded quickly, understanding the urgency of the situation. Officers arrived at Mrs. Loretta's house to gather details and begin the search for Aisha. Mrs. Loretta insisted that the police question Desmond and Tanisha about the events of that evening. When the police reached out to them, the couple stuck to their fabricated story, repeating the same version they had told Mrs. Loretta. However, Tanisha's recounting was less convincing. Her voice wavered, and she stumbled over her words, which raised the detective's suspicions. In a private conversation with the police, Mrs. Loretta revealed the recent tension between Aisha and Tanisha, sparked by the affair. She was adamant that Aisha would never disappear without a word, and her conviction led the police to treat the case with even more seriousness. Desmond and Tanisha quickly became the prime suspects in Aisha's disappearance. The police obtained a warrant to search Desmond's home and car. During the search of the vehicle, they found Desmond's gun in the glove compartment. A quick inspection revealed that one bullet was missing from the magazine. The gun was sent for forensic analysis to determine if it had been recently fired, and both Tanisha and Desmond were subjected to gunshot residue tests on their hands and clothing. The results came back incriminating. Traces of gunshot residue were found on Tanisha's hands and clothes. Confronted with the evidence, Tanisha was brought in for further questioning. At first, she continued to deny any involvement in Aisha's disappearance. However, under pressure, her story began to change. She admitted to taking Desmond's gun from the car and confronting Aisha, but claimed she had only fired the weapon into the air to scare her cousin into leaving Desmond alone. She insisted she hadn't killed Aisha, but this confession only deepened the police's suspicions. Investigators then analyzed the cell phone data from Desmond and Tanisha to track their movements on the night Aisha vanished. The location data led them to the remote swamp area where the crime occurred. The police, along with a cadaver dog trained to detect human remains, thoroughly searched the swamp. After hours of scouring the murky area, the dogs led the officers to a shallow, secluded part of the swamp where Aisha's body had surfaced, weighed down by stones but now partially exposed. With the discovery of Aisha's body, the case against Desmond and Tanisha was solidified. Both were arrested on the spot. The overwhelming evidence and the pressure of impending justice forced them to confess to their crimes. Desmond admitted to helping Tanisha dispose of the body, while Tanisha confessed to shooting Aisha in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The trial was set for October 15th, just weeks after the confession. Mrs. Loretta attended the court proceedings, her heart heavy with grief and a profound sense of betrayal. She watched as the two people she had trusted were brought to justice. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was delivered. Desmond was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in covering up Aisha's murder, while Tanisha received a life sentence without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. As the sentences were read, Mrs. Loretta felt a mix of sorrow and relief. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring her daughter back. The once close-knit family was shattered beyond repair, leaving Mrs. Loretta to grapple with the loss and the haunting memory of what had transpired. The echoes of that fateful night in the swamp would linger in her mind forever, a tragic reminder of how love, betrayal, and jealousy could destroy lives.